does is, and by the way, everything Bart Ehrman says, if you have a Bible, a modern translation, like New American Standard, New International Version, or the New King James Version, in the footnotes, practically everything that Bart Ehrman points out, like, they've been hiding this from you Christians, and you look and you say, wow, I didn't know that Mark 6, chapter 16, the last few verses weren't even in the oldest manuscripts, and you start getting all intimidated and stuff like that. But that's already in our Bible. If we just read the footnotes or in the margins, we're already told all this stuff. So he's not even telling us anything new. It's just the radical conclusions that he draws from that is something that's rather new and much too radical even for most New Testament scholars today. But he says, look, when you look, there's between 200,000 and 400,000. We'll give him the 400,000, by the way. About 400,000 variants among the New Testament copies. Okay, now, that's crazy because that's 3 times as many words are in the New Testament. So he's saying there's more discrepancies than there are words. So it almost, to the untrained reader, you might think, well, man, we need to just ditch the whole Bible because we can't be sure of any word. Okay? And he just throws it out there as if every word in the New Testament is in question when it really isn't. See, the reason why we have over 400,000 variants is because we got so many copies. The more copies you have, the more possibility that the copyists might have made errors. And so when you have over 26,000 ancient handwritten copies of the New Testament, you're going to get an awful lot of variants. So he says basically, look, with all these variants, there's no way to determine what the originals actually said. Then he even says, and this is misleading, there's no 3rd or 4th generation copies. So basically, it's like, this is the originals. Okay, here's the originals. Okay? And then a 1st generation copy would be a copy of the original. 2nd generation copy would be a copy of the 1st generation of copies. 3rd would be of the 2nd. 4th, it's kind of like playing a telephone game, okay? And he says we have no 3rd or 4th generation copies. Number one, even if we didn't, it'd still be better. Even if the zeros we have are 5th generation copies of the New Testament originals, that would still be head and shoulders better than anything else from the 1st century AD. So that's number one. Number two, there's no way Bart Ehrman can prove that. Because how does he know? You get basically by about 200 AD, with the writings of the church fathers and the copies that we have, we can produce, for all practical purposes, almost the entire New Testament by 200 AD. Let's say the New Testament was completed by 70, 80, 90, let's say 100 AD. We'll just go with a real conservative, or a real common figure. Let's say the whole New Testament was completed by 100 AD. Let's say we have copies that go back to 200 AD, like the Chester, Beatty, Papyri, and all. He's acting like, well, these were probably copied from 170 AD, copies, which were copied from 140 AD, which were copied from 130 AD. He doesn't know that. How does he know? Maybe whoever is these copies from 200 AD might have been copies of 2nd generation or 1st generation copies. Okay? I doubt very much when Tertullian in 220 AD or Irenaeus in 180 AD, these are like the biggest guns in the entire church. I doubt they were quoting from lousy manuscript copies. Okay? There's at least two 2nd century church leaders by the mid-1st century AD that already were quoting from the last portion of the Gospel of Mark, and then Irenaeus quotes from it in 180 AD. So just because we don't have any older manuscripts with it, I think we ought to question whether or not we should just toss it aside. So even those who think that it wasn't in the original, they leave it in there in brackets. It's almost like, well, we don't want to completely take it out of there because we're not really quite, fully sure. So whatever the case, he misleads people into thinking it's like the telephone game. I'll play a telephone game with my students, and I would whisper in their ears for 9th grade Life of Christ Bible. And I try to whisper something that they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I would say, Willie McCovey hit 45 home runs in 1969. I was a Willie McCovey fan. He did. He won the MVP. He batted .320 that year at 126 RBIs. So if I whispered that into your ear and it wasn't written on the board, and especially if you were 9th graders, you never even heard of Willie McCovey. Some of them, if they follow baseball, they know about McCovey's Cove, where Barry Bonds under steroids kept hitting the ball into the water. But other than that, they didn't know who Willie McCovey was, even though he's a Hall of Famer. But as I tell, by the time it gets done, we go through a class of like 20 students. It's not even close. It's not even recognizable, the message in there at all, okay? But that whispering, number one, it doesn't even represent the way oral tradition is spread. Communities that don't write, tribal peoples that don't have a written language, they get an entire family and they say, it's your job to memorize our traditions. So sometimes they have traditions memorized that have more words than the entire Bible. And from one generation to the next, it's passing on with about 99% accuracy. So number one, oral tradition alone does a lot better than that because you get specialists in that field who are trained in that field. But number two, the New Testament was not copied orally. It wasn't passed on orally. And so basically with my students, I'll write down, the other one I write down is Cassius Clay, because they don't know who Cassius Clay is. They know Muhammad, everybody in the world knows Muhammad Ali, but our young kids don't know Cassius Clay. That tells us how bad it is with our youth. If you don't know who Cassius Clay is, you don't know history. And but I put Cassius Clay knocked out Sonny Liston in the first round. And that's true. In their rematch, he knocked out Sonny Liston in the first round. So when I write that out, I show it to the first person, they copy it, and it's identical. And then by the time it gets to the third or fourth person, somebody's handwriting gets a little sloppy, so you got maybe a letter or two that are out to lunch. By the time I get to the fifth guy, I'll take the second generation copy, only 2 steps removed from the originals. I'll take that copy and say, now compare it to this. This is a second generation copy. And a lot of my students yell, that's cheating. You can't do that. I said, it's not cheating. If you're copying the Word of God and you got a 220 AD copy and somebody brings up to you a 110 AD copy, aren't you going to compare the two? And if there's differences, especially if they don't make sense, aren't you going to favor that earlier copy? So by the time we get to the end of the room, I think on the average, there's like one letter. By the way, I think that's supposed to be an O. I think I spelled it wrong, but by the end of the copy, there's usually 1 or 2 letters that are misspelled, but we know exactly what it means. And so he's not really being honest with us there. So let's respond to Bart Ehrman, but basically keep in mind this idea where he says that we don't even have 3rd or 4th generations. How do you know that? You have no way of knowing that. And again, Irenaeus in 180 AD is quoting New Testament scripture all over the place. I doubt he's using some copy that was just copied yesterday. And Tertullian himself wrote that we still had authentic writings in the Palestine area, in the area of Israel, and he was writing about 200 AD. So all I can figure is authentic writings either meant that the originals were still around and you could refer to them, or extremely reliable copies of the originals, so everybody knew these were by far the